Thank you. Hello everyone, croeso, diolch yn fawr am ymuno hefo ni. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Talk starts 4:30 until about 5:30 with hopefully some time for some questions at the end. As Mark has already mentioned, the original advertising for this included both Anna Williams and myself delivering the talk, but Anna's away on holiday at the moment. So I'm afraid you're going to have to put up with me for both parts of the talk. Anna and I are community and education officers for North Wales Wildlife Trust, and I cover North East Wales and Anna covers North West Wales. And with such a job title, we obviously engage a lot with communities. Our work is hugely varied, as is the trust work in general in North Wales. And we do get involved in a lot of community projects where we're creating wildflower meadows. So hopefully we'll be able to give you some insights and some advice and guidance on what we've learned through the years, what works and what doesn't, what to look out for, and the second half of the talk will be about how to maintain your wildflower meadow. So we'll get started. Okay, so starting with a little bit of terminology, so we avoid any confusion. Apologies, first of all, to those of you who already know this. I just want to make sure that everybody is familiar with the vocabulary we're going to be using. So to start with, there's that first word, wildflowers, but the question is wild to where? Well, we often assume that wild means native, but native to where? So native plants are those that occur naturally in an area, having developed over a long period of time and with close interactions to wildlife and the weather and the climatic conditions for that particular area. So, what about perennial and annual? Perennial plants live for several years, compared with annuals and biennials, for that matter, which die after they've grown from seed, flowered, and dropped their seed. Annuals do it all within 1 year, biennials do it within 2 years. But perennials live for several years, and many of them can exist in a vegetative state without flowering for quite some time. Okay, soil type is an important consideration when designing and planting your meadow or area of a garden. So it's helpful to know your soil. Is it sandy? Is it loamy? Is it full of clay? Is it acidic or is it alkaline? Different plants thrive in different soil conditions and may require different management. If you want to find out the pH test, the pH of your soil, then you can buy a simple test from a garden centre to find out the pH. Or if you want something a bit more precise, then you can take a soil sample from your garden, take it to an agricultural supplier like Winstay, for example, and you can do a soil test for £15–20, and they'll tell you exactly what the pH of your soil is. These garden kits are a little bit hit and miss, I find. But, so there's an option there. Also, you want to find out what kind of texture your soil has. You know, is it loamy? Is it clay? Is it sandy? And the easiest way to do that is to take a little bit between your fingers, pour some water on it, and rub it between your fingers. If it's tacky and sticky, then there's an element of clay in it. If it's got little bits of grit in it, then possibly it's alluvial or gritty clay. If it's got a very, very crumbly texture and breaks apart very easily, that means there's more sand content, which means it's more free draining. Moisture is also an important element of soils when it comes to meadows. Moisture retentive sites tend to mean that the grass grows quicker. So if you have a site that receives a lot of moisture or retains a lot of moisture because it's clay, for example, then it becomes a little bit more difficult to establish a wildflower meadow. It's not impossible, but it just makes life a little bit more difficult because the grasses tend to overpower your wildflowers. Okay. So to start with, let's just make the distinction between native perennial wildflower meadows and cornfield annual mixtures or meadows. On the photo on the right-hand side, you can see an annual cornfield mix. These are really popular, particularly in urban areas. You'll see them lots on roundabouts and other communal green spaces. They're colourful, they make a great impression, and what's great about them is you can use them on fertile soil. Loads of different seed mixes with a variety of species which would not necessarily occur together in the wild, and they're not necessarily native to the UK. But we tend to use cornfield mixtures or annual mixtures where we're trying to win people over. The idea of wildflower meadows is a bit more, people are aware of it a lot more these days than they were, say, 5 or 10 years ago. And sometimes people think in the back of their minds when they think of a wildflower meadow, it's actually an annual meadow. They do look great. They are very, very colourful. The perennial meadow, which you see on the picture on the left-hand side there, are a bit more subtle in terms of the colour, and they require a different management regime. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So, the options available to you for your wildflower perennial meadow is to leave the grass to grow long, or plant plug plants. So let's look at that first one. Leave the grass to grow long. Basically, that involves putting your mower away for a short period of time and seeing what grows naturally in your garden. You may be lucky. You may have orchids which have been just waiting for the opportunity to flower and set seed in your garden. All you have to do is stop mowing. Very interesting to find out what you already have on your site, because this will tell you whether or not it needs enhancing, or whether or not you can just manage it as a wildflower meadow. You'd be very lucky if you have great diversity of wildflowers. Quite often, particularly in gardens where the soil has been disturbed or reseeded, you'll need to improve the diversity in some way. Option 2 is to plant plug plants. Option 3 is to remove turf and sow seeds on bare soil. Option 4 is to scarify the sward, add local seed, or enhance the sward somehow. And option 5 is to cut and remove hay at least once per year. So I'll go through each option in turn. As I said, the first option, give yourself some time off with the lawnmower. Choose areas where you can see different shaped leaves or weeds. Areas where there's a bit of diversity going on. You don't have to, even before you let things flower, you can generally see if there's a lot of diversity in the grass. And there might be some interesting stuff in there, like I said, which pop up and never had the opportunity to flower before. In the photo, we had this is actually Anna's meadow at her home. She had a start with loads of daisies, buttercups came up, bugle popped up as well, all popular with early pollinators. And this was followed by plants like knapweeds, catsia, bird's foot trefoil. And as she tells me, it was a delight to the eye right through the spring and the summer season. But you need to be patient because not every garden will have this seed bank in the soil. But if you keep cutting and removing the grass year on year and then let it grow, you might find that the flowers will come through once the grasses are weakened. In this picture, you can see lots of lovely white clover in the foreground. This is a wonderful wildlife garden. I think was involved in wildlife gardening competition that Anna ran a few years back. And white clover produces lots of nectar and pollen. They have quite a short flower tube, shorter than red clover, making it easier for honeybees and short-tongued bumblebees to access the nectar. That said, they also attract long-tongued bees like and solitary bees, such as leafcutter bees and mining bees.
Iwan, just to let you know, that garden you've just shown.
Yes.
Just in case anyone knows, that's Kate and Jeff Gibbs' garden in Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwyrndrobwllllantysiliogogogoch. Anyone knows Kate and Jeff Gibbs?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's their garden.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's a wonderful combination of dry stone wall and bug hotels in the background there, and then a nectar-rich border. Absolutely fantastic looking garden. And it's no surprise that it belongs to them. Okay, if you're really lucky, like this couple on the Llŷn Peninsula, who had no idea that by leaving their grass to grow, they would end up with a meadow full of orchids. Like I say, you've got to be lucky, but it's worth a try. Okay, on to option number 2. The second option is to plant some plug plants into an existing sward. In order to do this, you need to cut the grass short, very short, as short as possible, and remove the turf around the areas where you're going to be planting. This is absolutely essential. If you can really hammer the grass back, you can plant directly into bare soil. You do want to encourage as much bare soil as possible. It gives your plug plants the best possible option. Sorry, the best possible opportunity. Plant your plug plants in groups. You can get your plug plants from a number of different companies, and I'll put a list up at the end of the slideshow for you to have a look at those. They are quite expensive, and given that it's actually quite easy to grow your own plug plants, I would highly recommend that you do that. And the benefit of doing that as well is you can collect some local seed, grow them in trays or in little plug trays, and then once they've grown, you can plant them out in your meadow. And it's basically a ready-made little plant. So you don't have to go to quite so much effort as you would if you were seeding, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a minute. This is the same site the following spring. This is a garden in Llanberis. Let's go back to that last picture. You see the wall in the background. And usually it's things like oxeye daisy, which proliferate in the first couple of years. They tend to be quite prevalent for the first maybe 3 to 5 years of your meadow, and then slowly they'll die back as other perennials start to take a hold. This slide is of the North Wales Housing Association, who approached Anna, asking if they could make this little piece of grass more interesting for people and for wildlife. And so she planted some plug plants into the existing grassland, into the existing sward, which to her seemed by far the most suitable option in this urban setting. So they bought 200 native plug plants and planted it with some local volunteers. And the Housing Association is on Ffordd y Ffiniog, opposite our nature reserve, Ffiniog. A few years later, and this is how the site looks. great place for wildlife and full of flowers for people to enjoy. And I suppose there's a little note here from Anna saying, imagine if every housing association did this on their unused pieces of grass that generally just get mown to death every year. All these little pockets of small green spaces could become so much more if we put our minds to it. So I started talking about a number of different wildflowers already. Here they are one by one. These are all good flowers to have in a perennial meadow. So let's just play a little quiz. You don't have to shout out, but just test yourself and see how many of these you might recognize. First one there, lovely little yellow flower, loads of protein-rich nectar loaded into this plant, much loved by many butterflies and bees. It's bird's foot trefoil. Crafancyrarth in Gymraeg. Anyone recognize this one? Bit of a, well, quite a long flowering season. Tends to be more towards the midsummer, late summer. Field scabious, of course. This is a great one to leave, especially through the autumn. Knapweed. The lovely seed heads, the finches and the birds come and feed on them. Anyone recognize this one? Lady's bedstraw, lovely aroma to it. It should be an easy one for most people. Red clover, Million yn Goch in Gymraeg. Easy peasy. Meadow buttercup. Meadow cranesbill. Mentioned this one already, oxeye daisy. And although easily confused with bugle, this is actually self-heal. Long flowering plant, much loved by many insects. Because it's an umbellifer, the insects can land on it and they can gorge without having to fly from one flower to another. Yarrow, the mealvile in Gymraeg, mealvile, 1,000 leaves. And last but not least, yellow rattle. Right, so Anna was involved with a big school gardening project at this site in Caernarfon. They needed the digger to remove piles of building rubble, removed very weedy and grassy patches to start making a wildlife garden for the school. Here in the picture, the girls are mixing some seed with dry sand. You can buy dried kiln sand from your local builder's yard. Very good stuff for making your seed go further, especially for sowing with children. You can see where they've already sown, and it just generally means you get a better distribution of seed rather than seed landing in clumps where they'll compete against each other. This seed mix was sown at 4 grams per square meter. Most seed mixes these days are 3 grams. And then they're spreading them over the site. The holes that you see there for fruit trees. And then after the seeding, they followed that up with some hand weeding of some of the most pernicious weeds, such as docks, nettles, and thistles, which tend to move in very quickly into bare soil like this. The creation of bare ground is important for successful germination of wildflower seedlings. Most meadow wildflowers thrive in soils that are particularly low in nutrients. That's because the grasses can't compete quite as much with the flowers. However, it's not always necessary to strip the top layer of turf, as you see in this picture, because that involves a lot of work. And as Anna has mentioned here, involved a digger. It's also possible to heavily scarify your grassland or your lawn. And the idea is to create enough bare patches of soil at least 40% bare patches, so that when you're sowing, seed is falling on bare ground. More on this in a moment. So this is the same site 2 years later, Ysgol yr Hendre. You can move on. Option 3, wildflower bank sown on bare soil. Banks are very good because they're sloping, they're free draining, so the grasses tend to struggle a little bit. If it's south facing, even better. So I think we're back in Anna's garden here. This was sown in 1997 on bare soil in the garden. She says it improves every year, but you have to be patient. And you have to be patient because it does improve year on year, but it is a slow process. You get cowslips and primroses early on in the year, with loads of bird's foot trefoil, lady's mantle, as you can see in the photo here, musk mallow, meadow cranesbill, field scabious, oxeye daisy, yellow rattle, black knapweed. The bees and butterflies love it, and Anna tends to cut this site in September or as late as possible. You can tend to do that with sites which are quite free draining. You can leave them a little bit later until you cut and collect. This is our Bangor office, Llysgarth, a small patch of land, about 5 meters by 3.5, prepared by volunteers and sown in March 2018. And please feel free to come and see us in our garden at our head office in Bangor. We will have several open days planned later on this spring and summer. And there we are in July 2019, a proper town or urban meadow. Next, a quick slide about yellow rattle, sometimes called the meadow maker. Not always the silver bullet it's always made out to be, but a very useful plant to have in your meadow because it's parasitic or hemi-parasitic. So it feeds basically on the grasses or the roots of grasses, and it takes nutrients and water from them. So it makes them a bit weaker. And what this does is it opens the sward up a little bit, providing an opportunity for flowers to come through and compete with the grasses. As I've already said, meadows take patience. It takes a long time for a meadow to settle, so you're not going to create it overnight. And so, Plant Life estimates that it can take at least 15 years before your meadow restoration has really started to pay dividends. But since all this kind of urban meadow creation is fairly new, we're still finding out how these newly created meadows evolve over time. But yeah, just to mention there, like yellow rattle is an autumn sown wildflower. It's an annual, so it grows from seed every year, and then the mother plant dies, and it's the seed that grows the following year. So you just need to remember that if you're going to sow some yellow rattle, and the seed doesn't stay viable for very long either. So if you're buying yellow rattle or collecting yellow rattle, get it down as soon as possible, within days or a couple of weeks at most. This is KI Tanabulch, where there's a beautiful show of greater butterfly orchids. KI Tanabulch, for those of you who don't know, is on the Llyn Peninsula. This is a traditional hay meadow, again owned by Plant Life, managed by the Wildlife Trust to enhance the wildflower value of the site. The greater butterfly orchids, the yellow rattle, eyebrights, many more plants. You can join us at the annual Greater Butterfly Orchid Count in late June. This is one of the coronation meadows that the Prince of Wales had a great idea back in 2012 to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of the Queen, to create a meadow, a new meadow in every county in the country, and this is one of those. I'll briefly mention green hay because some of you may have heard about it, but really, it's a topic for another talk entirely. But basically, what we're doing here is cutting a flower-rich hay meadow, like they did in the Jubilee Coronation Meadows project. Cut a site and basically remove the hay, which has obviously got loads and loads of seed in it. It's moved to a receptor site and then spread. Here in the picture, you can see it spread with a muck spreader. And basically, it's a way of transporting seed from a donor site to a receptor site. Quite tricky, logistically very difficult, but is a very, very good way of proliferating local provenance seed, which is really what we want to be trying to do. As I mentioned earlier, most wildflower meadows thrive on soils that are low in nutrients. The field that you see in this picture here is a agriculturally improved grassland, in as far as it may have been drained, reseeded, fertilized. So if you're hoping to create a meadow on something like this, first thing you need to do is to lower the nutrient status or the nutrient load of your site. And that can take a number of years. You do this by cutting and removing the grass, ideally when it's growing at its strongest. Because obviously that's what farmers would have done in the past. They would have cut the grass when it was growing at its strongest to provide as much food for their livestock during the winter months. If you can combine this cutting regime with heavy grazing, so you turn the sheep into your meadow after you've cut your hay, then you stand a good chance of reducing the fertility of your soil pretty quickly. Things like nitrogen do tend to leach away from the soil within a few years. But obviously, again, it depends on the site and the location, whether it gets a lot of moisture. If it's a floodplain meadow, for example, then that moisture and those nutrients are going to be replaced on an annual basis. So each site is different. Also, you need to make sure you remove any pernicious weeds, such as docks, thistles, and nettles. Often, the best way to do this is by hand, but it is time-consuming. It is hard work. You may want to think about that when it comes to the scale of the meadow you want to create. Okay. Okay. So, on to annual cornfield mixtures. Remember that slide we looked at earlier on, the difference between an annual and a perennial wildflower meadow. This is quite suitable. This annual cornfield mix of seed is suitable for gardens, parks, community spaces, community green spaces, school settings, roundabouts, anywhere where you've got quite a lot of fertility in the soil. You need to expose the soil, create a nice seed bed. This could be done by removing the turf or heavily scarifying. Again, mix your seeds with some dry sand so you can see where you've sown, as Anna has done in this picture here with the children. And I think this site, yes, was sown in early November, so autumn sowing. And late June the following year, this is what you get. Cornflowers, poppies, corn cockle, corn marigolds, all species that were common in arable margins, in fields, farmers' fields, as weeds, basically. Weeds that just remained in the soil alongside the crops that the farmers were trying to grow. They too have declined in the wild because of agricultural intensification and seed cleaning as well. I'm sure some of you may remember seeing lots of these around the margins of arable fields when you were younger, but it's not really an image you see that much these days, unfortunately. This is Ysgol Llanllechid. They wanted a wildflower area in this part of the school, but there was a problem. Children, they were running through the area and the seed just wouldn't establish. So what Anna did is she built a raised bed, filled it with soil, and they sowed some wildflower seed, some annual wildflower seed in April 2015. Although it was a little bit late, sowing times do depend on the weather. You can sow in the autumn, you can sow in the spring. They both have their merits, or you can do both if you want a belt and braces approach. And here's the site in August the following year. Fantastic show, corn marigolds, corn chamomile. Those are the white daisy-like flowers, cornflowers and corn cockle. So those are the 4 species you tend to get in an annual cornfield mix. Here's another, I think this is another school site that Anna was working with. As you can see in that picture, pretty much completely dominated by grasses, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Even if your site is dominated by grasses, this is still a much better habitat for wildlife than closely mown grass. Closely mown grass has its place, don't get me wrong, but if you compare that and the amount of insects flying around on mown grass with an area like this, you'll be amazed how much wildlife there is just in long grass like this. So let your grass grow, even if you've got nothing of interest, it's still a much better habitat. And of course, you can mow pathways through it and make it look nice. Have a mosaic of different aged grasses in your garden. The more diverse the grassland, the more diverse the number of species that will make it their home. Meadows supports a huge variety of native plants and animals. They help maintain our environment and climate in good order. We've seen an incredible reduction of this habitat in the UK since basically the Second World War, since farming became so much more intensified and we all demanded cheap food from our supermarkets. 97% of wildflower meadows in the UK have disappeared since 1960. And that, I'm afraid to say, is a conservative estimate. Meadows have been an integral part of our landscape for thousands of years, and the variety of plant species keep livestock healthy, keep wildlife healthy, and farms which were traditionally managed had lots of herb-rich meadows, often called cae meddyg, or hospital fields in Welsh, where the animals would self-diagnose, I suppose, or self-prescribe and eat the plants required to make themselves feel better. Meadows help keep our soils healthy. The roots go deeper than monocultures of grass. And the value of different legumes, like clovers and vetches, for locking carbon in the soil is very significant. Meadows lock in a lot of carbon because the exudae from the roots, the carbon is basically deposited in the soil. And these roots can infiltrate the subsoil down to the subsoil and deposit the carbon deeper down in the soil, as long as your site isn't too compacted. If you see a wildflower meadow, a wildflower-rich meadow being damaged, call Natural Resources Wales helpline, and it may be a site that's already got protection, and it may be being destroyed illegally. You'll come across sites which are protected as sites of special scientific interest. I made a little bit of a hash of Anna's notes there, but you get the idea. These are really important habitats, and there's no surprise in seeing such a significant disappearance of that particular habitat in our landscape. We also see a huge reduction in the number of invertebrates available as food source for birds and mammals. So, you know, these habitats really do underpin a huge number of our native wildlife. As I mentioned earlier on, you have to be patient with meadows, be realistic about your expectation. Meadow creation takes a long time. If you've got a site which is very poor quality in terms of soil nutrients, so it's nutrient poor, then you stand a much better chance of creating a meadow much quicker. Generally, the more nutrient rich your site is, the longer it's going to take for you to establish a wildflower meadow. There's a number of reasons why wildflowers may not be widespread throughout a grassland, ranging from seed source, the method of sowing, enhancement, past enhancement of the site, so it's been fertilized or drainage put in, soil nutrient levels, as I said, and the way you managed the site following the restoration. So we're going to look a little bit closer at maintaining your meadow, because that is the bottom line when it comes to how well your meadow is going to perform. But before I do that, I'm going to need to put up a new presentation. So I'll just leave this slide up for a second for you to make a note of some of the seed suppliers that we use. I'll just reiterate there the importance of collecting local flowers or local seed if you can, obviously with permission. What we'd like to do is increase the amount of local provenance seed available in the landscape. But unfortunately, it's not always possible. But there are lots of companies who provide slightly more generic UK-based seed mixes, which you can use at your site. But it's no substitute for native or local provenance seed if it's an option available to you. Right, I'm going to stop sharing that one for a second. We can see how many people are involved. Hello, everyone. And I'm going to put up a new slide from the beginning. Mark, can you tell me whether you can see just a picture, or can you see picture and text?
At the moment, I can just see my profile picture.
Just your profile picture. Oh, right. Okay. I haven't shared, have I? Hang on.
Just while Iwan's doing that, like we said at the start, this talk will be recorded, and we probably will put it on our YouTube channel. So all those links and things will be available. You'll also get an email tomorrow with Iwan's email and Anna's email if you've got any other questions regarding the talk afterwards. I can see that now, Iwan. That's all fine.
Fantastic. Mark. Okay, so maintenance. Cynnal a chadw. This is what I'm going to talk about is generally about managing sites, managing quite small sites by hand or with machinery. But grazing is a big part of meadow management, and a game changer when it comes to establishing, really decent wildflower meadows. I'll touch on both approaches, but I just wanted to mention there that how important grazing animals are, and if you can get grazing animals onto your site, it will really improve the way your meadow establishes over time. So, as I said, the way you manage your meadow will be the main driver as to how your meadow evolves over time. Dynamic habitat, and every meadow has a different starting point depending on the history and the soil type, the aspect, etc., etc. So whether you're maintaining or restoring an existing grassland, or maybe you're creating a new meadow entirely from scratch in your garden or a community green space, for example, each site is different. Soil type, the fertility, the existing community of plants that you have there, and obviously how the site has been managed in the past. All of these things will have a huge impact on your meadow, so it's important to remember that each site is unique. The key to success, and this is something that I always find useful, is to try and mimic how these sites would have been managed traditionally. So if you understand how farmers would have maintained or how they would have managed their land, you can understand the principles and the management required to recreate the same thing in your own gardens or on your own land. These sites would have been managed by farmers for hundreds of years, if not millennia. And some of the most amazing meadows that we have in North Wales are sites which have been wildflower meadows for 150 years plus. So that gives you some idea of how long-term a project your meadow is going to be. But it's most definitely a really worthwhile thing to do. And to watch your meadow evolve over time is a joy, if not hard work sometimes. The key to success is always to remove the cuttings. The site, the season, the weather will vary from year to year, and so will your cutting regime. But removing the cuttings is essential. Whatever happens, you have to do that. If you leave your cut grass on the site, the nutrients go back into the soil. You also create a thatch, so you don't have any bare soil. Moss then thrives on your site, and wildflower seeds, if they even do have the opportunity to drop their seed, will land on a thick thatch or on moss and won't be able to germinate. So you always remove the cuttings. That is the golden rule. And you have to be realistic. You have to be realistic about scale. The scale should be based on your capacity to manage the area. Of course, you have to have the right tools for the job. And that includes grazing animals if that's an option that's open to you. Okay, let's talk a little bit about scale. If your meadow is going to be managed by hand, and it's going to require a lot of work to move it along, for example, it might be quite a fertile site or a moisture-retentive site that you prefer, then you're going to be needing to do additional and regular weeding, especially in the first few years. Lots of weeding, lots of raking, lots of cutting and collecting. So you'll be extremely glad that you have chosen a really small, manageable area to be able to stay on top of it. It's better to manage a small area effectively than bite off more than you can chew and pull your hair out because you can't keep on top of it. The picture you can see here is an example of a long-term meadow restoration project on private land in Dyffryn Clwyd, in the Vale of Clwyd. And this is what we call semi-improved grassland. So at some point in the past, a farmer has decided to try and improve this site by applying fertilizer or draining or turning the soil. It's semi-improved because that's happened quite a long time ago. It's never been intensively managed, but it has been altered. Okay, so that community of species that exist on that site has been altered by agriculture. What we want is a more natural state, and to do this, we regularly cut the hay. So with regular hay cuts, and we continuously assess how the site is developing before deciding what to do next. You could only ever approach a project of this scale if you had access to machinery or lots of money to pay someone else to do it. You may have access to small machinery, a small tractor like a Kubota, or pedestrian machinery like a BCS, an Alpine tractor, or those old school reciprocal cutters that cut a bar that cuts sideways like that. They're really good for managing small meadows, or you may just have access to a strimmer or a brush cutter, which does a pretty good job on a small area. A lawnmower, preferably with variable height settings, is extremely useful, especially when you're establishing a new meadow. But at the Wildlife Trust, we love to advocate the use of the scythe as a sustainable tool for managing your meadow. This is how meadows would have been managed for thousands of years. The community would have come together. They would have managed small fields, about an acre in size. In fact, an acre the delineation may be based on what one person can cut in a day. But I've also heard that 1 acre is what an ox can plow in a day. So I'm not sure which is true. But anyway, the people were managing small meadows, and they were doing it communally. And if you can combine those two things, small meadow and get the community involved, then this is a fantastic way to manage your meadow. It's clean, has no need for fuel. It's extremely efficient. It's peaceful and quiet, and frankly, it's a very effective way of cutting your grass. And the huge bonus to yourselves would be it's also a healthy way to maintain your site, so you get a bit of health and well-being in there as well. We run lots of scything workshops, so keep an eye out for free workshops in North Wales in this coming year, where you'll cover things like how to set up your scythe, how to develop your technique, and how to maintain the sharpness of your blade. We tend to use Austrian scythes these days because they're quite adaptable, and you can use different thickness of blades for different situations. We're also trying to generate a scything revolution, chwyldro pladirio, a lovely ring to it in Welsh. We have a Facebook group, North Wales Scything Cooperative. Scything enthusiasts can chat about their sites and possibly even come together in a kind of scythers assemble kind of way when people need a hand mowing their small meadows. So you might want to check that out. Okay, so in the earlier talk, I talked about annuals and perennials. Annual cornfield meadows and perennial herb-rich meadows. Okay, these are the two types of meadows that you can create. The maintenance of those meadows depends on whether or not it's annual or perennial. So we'll start with annual. It's quite straightforward. Again, what you want to be doing is mimicking that traditional management. How farmers used to manage their cornfield meadows. Basically, they would harvest them, then they'd get in there and they'd plough them. They deal with any weed species, probably back then by simply hand pulling or frequent cutting. And then they'd sow a new crop. And these arable weeds, or these annual wildflowers, which would be considered weeds at the time, would just come back year on year. You have to expose the seed to fresh soil and also to the elements for them to germinate. If you sow a wildflower meadow and then just leave it, eventually, in the first year, you'll get a wonderful show of all of these annuals coming up. In the second year, some of them will come up. In the third year, they'll have eventually disappeared as the perennial species in your meadow or the grasses take over, and the seed of your annuals doesn't find any bare ground to germinate into. So very simply, to maintain an annual meadow, you have to turn it every year. You have to do exactly like the farmer did. Instead of ploughing with a horse and cart, a horse and plough, you would turn it with your garden fork or a rotavator. They work on most soil types, and unlike perennial meadow mixtures, they do very well on fertile soils. The more fertility, the better. They're hungry plants, they grow very quickly, and they need to complete their life cycle all within that spring and summer. You need to apply this management every year. Okay, so you have to cut and clear it. You have to turn the soil, control the weeds, and you have to cultivate seed bed for the following year. Okay. Re-establishing cornfield annuals on the same site works better in some years than in others. It's worth topping up the seed bank. So it's worth topping up with seed every year, maybe for the first 3 to 5 years. You might find after 5 years, you've added enough seed. There's enough seed in the seed bank of the soil, if you like, for those flowers to flower, drop their seed, and germinate again the following year. As long as you turn the soil and keep the site free of weeds. Generally, what happens with cornfield meadows is year on year, the weeds become stronger, and you find it more and more difficult to keep on top of them. So you might want to consider, if you've got a fertile site, start off with a cornfield meadow. Start off with the annuals, get your lovely show of colour, turn it for a couple of years, cut and collect, and in that way you'll be reducing the fertility, and then slowly you can introduce some perennial wildflower species, and then start changing the way you manage the site. So we'll talk about perennial meadows next, sometimes called naturalized grassland. Traditionally, hay meadows or herbrage meadows are 80% grasses and 20% wildflowers. Management by mowing or grazing is essential to develop and maintain the structure, the balance, and the diversity of species that you have in the meadow. Without that management, the meadow becomes coarse and rank. You lose diversity and you lose that floral interest. And eventually it will turn to scrub and in the end into woodland. Grazing animals can play a huge role in meadow development, as I've already said, but it's generally only an option for farmers and landowners. In the absence of grazing livestock, you have to try and imitate the impact that those grazing animals would have had on your meadow. Okay, so just remember that when you're utterly confused at the end of this talk, and you're thinking about how you're going to manage your meadow, just try and think back to how farmers would have traditionally managed a perennial meadow. Well, they would have gone in there with a scythe, they would have cut the hay, they would have removed the hay. After that, they would have put their sheep and their horses and their cattle into the field to graze the aftermath. In doing that, the animals serve two purposes. They would graze the aftermath and graze the grass, knock the grass back so that the wildflowers had an opportunity to germinate and flower the following year. But also, in walking around the site, the animals would have poached the site and they would have pushed the seed into contact with bare or naked soil. So that's why grazing animals are so important. And in their absence, you have to mimic the impact that they would have had on the meadow. So in your first year of establishing your wildflower meadow, your perennial meadow, you need to mow regularly through the first year of establishment. This helps to maintain the balance between the faster growing grasses and the slower developing wildflowers. Okay. Ideally, a height of about 40 to 60 millimeters. If your mower will go as high as 10 centimeters, that's pretty good as well. And especially if you've got things like yellow rattle growing in your meadow, you want to make sure you're above the height of those flowering plants. And always, always, always follow that golden rule: collect and remove the cuttings. If that isn't possible, then maybe regular cutting is a way around that. So you're going out there on a weekly basis and topping your meadow at a height of about 40 to 60 millimeters, and knocking that grass back, stopping the grass from dominating, and giving those wildflowers an opportunity to establish. Be patient. Growth in the first year always tends to be quite vigorous, and you'll find the grasses will grow very quickly, and you'll have to mow it regularly to keep them knocked back. And because what you're trying to do is just give those wildflower seeds an opportunity in that vital first year to put on a bit of vegetative growth so they can flower in the second year. Okay? You're not going to get an amazing show like you do with the annuals in the first year with a perennial mix. You have to wait for the second year before they flower. Make sure I haven't missed anything. Okay. Once your meadow is established, so probably talking year 2, year 3 here, you've started to notice that the grass maybe isn't growing quite as strong as it used to, and bear with it because this does happen. Sites that we manage with a scythe, you do find year on year less and less grass and less hay being produced from that site, because the grasses is just struggling that little bit more because you've reduced the fertility year on year. Once you've established your grassland, you're happy with it, and the wildflowers have had a chance to establish themselves, you just settle down into an annual cut and collect. If you've got a particularly fertile site, you might want to carry on cutting maybe 2 or 3 times a year, just to keep knocking that grass back, just to reduce the fertility just that little bit more. Okay. The poorer the quality of your soil, the sooner you'll be able to settle into this 1 cut per year management. Okay. Progressive haymaking, I'll just mention something about that. That's something we kind of advocate with, a site like an acre site, which is perhaps a little bit too difficult for you to manage on your own. But don't worry, you don't have to cut the whole site in one day. You can cut it progressively. So you can start one end, do a few, pick a nice sunny day, get out there with your scythe or your strimmer, cut the grass, collect it, and then leave the next bit for the next sunny day. And then slowly you work your way across your meadow until you've cut it all by the end of the summer. This is a really good way of promoting biodiversity because you get a different age structure of grasses in your meadow, what they call a mosaic of grassland. So that's always worth thinking about that because it kind of takes the pressure off you having to cut the whole site in one day. You'll need to mow, once you've cut your hay and you've collected it, you'll need to mow the regrowth. Remember, you're doing this in the absence of grazing animals. Otherwise, you'll just put your sheep in there and they'll graze the aftermath. But in the absence of sheep, you have to do it with your lawnmower. So you have to go out there, cut it and collect it, and again, keep knocking that grass back. The lower you can cut it, the better. A strimmer is very good because every year you tend to kind of, you can cut into the grass a little bit and you can open up the soil so there's opportunities for seeds to germinate directly in the soil. Just in some years, depending on the weather, you may get a real rush of lush growth in the spring. Get out there, cut it back, knock back the grass quickly if you need to, and then lay off the lawnmower as soon as it gets to kind of mid-April, early May. Lay off the lawnmower, let the wildflowers proliferate. There's nothing you can do then about the grass growing. Always a good idea at the end of the season, when you've put the lawnmower to bed for wintertime, always a good idea to harrow or scanify the grass of the meadow at the end of the season. This removes any thatch that's built up, scratches the surface, provides opportunity for seed to germinate into soil. And again, you're basically mimicking what the sheep and the cattle would have done in hoofing or poaching the soil. Okay. So the number and the timing of your cuts depends on how old your meadow is. So whether it's new or an established grassland. Depends on the weather and the season. Of course, you can only make hay when the sun shines. You don't want to leave haymaking until it's too late in the season because the grass won't dry, so you won't be able to make hay. Much easier to manage a large amount of dried hay than it is wet grass. So you've got to work with the season. You've got to work with the summer. Also depends on the soil fertility and the condition. Obviously, you will be cutting more often if there's greater fertility in your soil. And as I said earlier on, you may have lots of strong growth in the first few years, but it will slow down as you start to get the management right. Also depends on your objective. Why do you have a wildflower meadow in your garden or on your land? Is it because you want to feed your animals in the wintertime, as farmers did? In which case, making hay is your priority. So you will cut the meadow when the grass is at its strongest growth. So you're capturing that energy to feed your animals in the winter. If your objective is biodiversity, you might want to leave the cutting of your site until much later in the season so that there's opportunities for as many different wildflowers to grow, flower and set their seed. And you might even leave some sections standing through the wintertime. Particularly seed heads of things like knapweed provide food for lots of birds. The empty stems of many plant species in the meadows provide a home for lots of invertebrates through the wintertime as well. So it depends on your objective. It's always a compromise when it comes to what time of year and when and how many times to cut your meadow. And also it depends on flowering times. So do you have a predominantly spring, summer, or late summer flowering meadow? Well, if it's a new meadow, you can decide. If it's an established meadow, then you need to have a look at how that meadow develops through the season before you decide what time of year to cut it. So we'll just have a quick look at that now. this is a table that's available online if you Google kind of flowering periods of typical grassland plants. It's important to observe, the flowering times of your plants, especially if you're inheriting an existing meadow. The timing of your hay cuts will promote certain species as they're allowed to flower and set seed. Cutting too soon in the season may inhibit the spread of later summer flowering plants like scabious and harebell, which tend to be later summer flowering species. If you decide on a spring flowering grassland or a meadow, leave your meadow and cut from January onwards. Let it flower in May, June, and then as soon as it's finished flowering and dropped its seed, get in there, cut it, remove it, and then graze the aftermath either with sheep or cattle or your lawnmower for the next couple of months until winter or until autumn, and then stop cutting. If you decide that you want a predominantly summer flowering grassland, then you could be cutting your meadow every 2 to 3 weeks through the growing season, preferably at anywhere between 40 to 100 mil height on a cutter power on your lawnmower. And then towards the end of May, early June, stop mowing, let the meadow do its thing, and then as soon as it's finished flowering, which will be kind of July, August, then you cut it, collect it, and then again cut for the remainder of the season until the grass stops growing. Just give you a couple of case studies here. This is a community project in Henllan, a bee and butterfly garden we created quite a while ago now. I remember this site because when we sowed into it, you could hardly call it soil. It was very much kind of builder's rubble, sand, gravel, hardly any soil whatsoever. And I remember sowing seed into it thinking, this is not going to work. But the picture taken here is the following season. So it established as a wildflower meadow incredibly quickly because the soil was so poor that even the grasses were struggling to grow. So basically these wildflower species were able to proliferate very, very quickly. So the moral of the story is the poorer the quality of the soil, the quicker you will be to establish a meadow that looks like this. Conversely, this is a site in Kaya Park in Wrexham where we've been creating meadows in kind of open green areas. Very fertile, very moisture retentive soil. What we've decided here is there's no point trying to bother with perennial wildflower meadow here because it just gets swamped by the grasses, and you end up with maybe 2 or 3 species of wildflowers in there. So we have the capacity, or Wrexham County Council have the capacity here to manage this as a cornfield meadow. So if you remember back to the slide previously, earlier on, they'll go in there, they'll cut it, they'll collect it, they'll rotivate or plough the soil, and then they'll deal with any weed species, and then they'll reseed the site every year to get this wonderful show of colour. And it's worth doing it in this location because it's an area that inspires people. It's looked down upon by quite a busy road, and it's a kind of flagship site to engage the community in wildflower meadows. Other options available to you might be wildflower turf, quite expensive, but it does have its uses, gives you a good start, and helps you get on top of the grasses that you've got on your site. Again, there's a little bit of prep, and I'm still fairly new to the whole use of wildflower turf. Basically, the cost is generally quite prohibitive, but you may find that this is a good substitute when all that preparation for seed sowing isn't something that you can do. So you can scratch your surface really knock back the grass, expose some soil, and you could effectively lay some wildflower turf on top of it, and you get an instant meadow. Over time, it still may reduce to a few species. Again, it depends on the fertility of your soil, but worth knowing about. Another thing to mention is hay. When it comes to the time when you're cutting your meadow, you will find there's lots of hay. So you're going to need to think about where you're going to put it. Can you bale it? Have you got a compost heap? Is the compost heap big enough to take all of that hay? The good news is it will rot down very, very quickly. In this picture that you see here, we use on kind of community sites like churchyards, we use a hand hay baler that we had built for the purpose of processing large amounts of grass. And then we're able to transport these little bales to people who have horses or animals for keeping over wintertime. Okay, I think I'm probably going to stop there, partly because my voice is starting to get a little bit croaky. There's so much more to talk about: weed control, cutting regimes. We talk a little bit about that mosaic grassland where you use them. You mow one area once a month, you mow another area once every 2 months, another area you leave for 6 months, another area you leave for 2 years. And you can play around with how you manage the grassland in your area. The greater diversity of habitat, the greater the diversity of insect species you'll find in there, and other species as well. Flowering lawns, that's another one to think about. If you do want to, if you don't want to let your meadow grow to be 50 to 60 centimeters tall, there are seed mixes out there which are full of species which are suitable for cutting at, say, 10 centimeters height. Sorry, 100 mil, 10 centimeters of height. And they're a particularly good one if you don't want to deal with a large amount of hay every year. And also another one is tussocky grassland. So if you do have an area where you can let the grass just become tussocky over time, they'll become anthills. You might even get green woodpeckers coming in and feeding on the ants. But to stop the site from developing into scrub and woodland, you will need to cut it every few years. But tussocky grassland is, something that deserves its place as well in terms of biodiversity. So important not to forget about that. Okay, I will hand back over to Mark, and I'll stop sharing and see if we've got any questions.
Hi, Iwan. I've got a couple of questions here. Sorry, I've got a little one.
That's okay, Mark. I'll have a quick read through the questions, or if anyone wants to put their camera on and ask a question, that's fine as well. Let's just have a quick look here. Okay, David Roberts. I have a 12 meter by 12 meter patch of bare ground, which is 15 meters away from a tidal lagoon. Never cultivated any soil on a shale bank. It's never been cultivated and it's on a shale bank. Any tips? Okay, if it's that close to a tidal area, you're going to get lots of salt-laden winds. If you remember back to that picture that we had of the meadow, someone's garden on the Llŷn Peninsula, who had orchids appear in their grassland, they had a hedge that limited the impact of salt-laden winds from sea. So You might want to put some kind of hedging to create a barrier. But there are also species that you can select, which would be suitable for coastal areas. So there is a coastal area seed mix specific for use in areas like that. But that doesn't sound like too large an area. You've got an opportunity to sow into it in this spring, and we're coming up to sowing season now. Get the seed down. Maybe sow some seed in some plug trays as well. So if your seed doesn't succeed, then you can follow it up with some plug planting later on in the season as well. So that's always a good kind of belt and braces approach to anyone who's creating a new meadow. But I would certainly recommend that you look at the different meadow mixes that are available from these companies, David. Question from Peter Hooper. You've mentioned brambles, dock nettles and thistles as pernicious weeds and needing removing. Is there a way of incorporating them as part of a wildflower meadow for their wildlife potential? Absolutely. He's asking, or should I establish separate areas elsewhere for them? Well, Peter, that depends entirely on what you want your final meadow to look like. There's no reason why you couldn't have all of those beautiful weeds, and I agree with you, they are incredibly important. No reason why you couldn't have those in your meadow, as long as you manage them. And if you do let things like thistles seed into your meadow, you will be weeding them out, or you will need to keep on top of them. Otherwise, the site gets overrun with these pernicious weeds. They're incredibly suited to establishing on bare soil and overpowering lots of other plants as well. So there's no reason why the two couldn't live alongside each other, but you will need to manage those meadows over time. So that's what I'll say about that. Brunel Afterday, diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much. Very informal, that's not a question, but diolch yn fawr iawn. Have you any so Caring for God's Acre is the place to look for those. Are you available for visiting our meadow and giving advice? Well, yes, we are. Depends where you are. If you're over in the west, then it'll be Anna coming out to see you. If you're over in the east, then that'll be me. It kind of depends on how much work we've got on, basically. If we've got lots of projects on, we have very little time for doing site visits. We do provide lots of advice and guidance on our website. So if you want to check out our web pages, and there's also lots of YouTube videos, both by the Wildlife Trust, but also by Plant Life on meadow creation. So there's lots of information out there. But yes, I agree. There's nothing better than having someone coming and having a look at your site. But yeah, it basically comes down to if we have the time to come and have a look at it. There are a couple of meadow groups in North Wales. There's a very strong group over in the west, run by Kate Gibbs, who was mentioned earlier on in the talk. So again, if you go to the Wildlife Trust website, I'm sure you can find links to that group through the website. And they basically visit meadows, talk about meadows, look at different management techniques, and basically kind of gen up on what works and what doesn't work. So you might want to join one of those groups. And I think Plant Life are also trying to establish a group in the east. but I don't know any more about that at the moment. But there are groups out there that you can join and find out more, and possibly even get them to come and visit your site as
Iwan, are you still doing the wildlife garden sessions?
We have, yes, on Fridays at Aberdeen, we have a wildlife gardening session, 10 till 12, where we tend to do kind of tasks which encourage our wildlife garden. It varies through the season, quite quiet through the winter, but certainly now coming into spring and summer, there'll be lots more work needed to be done. I wouldn't say we're quite as active as the wildlife garden in Llysgarth. But if you are based over in the west, then as I said earlier on, there are open days for visiting that garden.
Yeah, I was gonna add that, Iwan, that Anna's back doing quite a lot of the wildlife gardening sessions, and usually on a Wednesday. But if you contact Anna, and you'll get her email tomorrow to check when they're doing them. It's also a great place where you can come down, not just to get involved, but just to get some advice as well. You can speak to Iwan and Anna and other people there who can give you some great advice, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so at Aberdeen, we go for Friday mornings, 10 till 12. If anyone wants to come along. Okay, I think that's probably all.
I think it is. Yeah. So should we halt it there? Let everyone go and get their tea. Like I said, this has been recorded. You will get an email tomorrow, and there's links to the website on there, but there's also links to Anna and Iwan. And if you've got any direct questions, by all means ask them. And as Iwan said, he will try and get back to him depending on his workload, won't you, mate?
Yes, absolutely.
There's a lot of work we've got to do. So, no, thank you all for joining us. I'll end that talk there. Thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you, Iwan, for doing it.
Diolch yn fawr, croeso.
Diolch.
So, Iwan.